This webinar has been created by Australian and New Zealander women with Asherman syndrome. Thank you to the Women's Health and Research Institute of Australia and the Australian Women's Health Alliance for their support throughout this project. Please note this webinar has been created with a budget of $0 and very limited technical expertise. Every single person who has participated did so in their own free time. Please be tolerant of any tech issues. We have all done our very best. Another thing I'm keen to hear about is how women go when they make complaints about their care. Laura and Naomi, are you aware of women making complaints? Can you tell me what women are complaining about and what outcomes they might be hoping for?
Yeah, absolutely. Many women have tried, mostly to the level of the doctor or hospital, because the two biggest complaints we see often are the lack of informed consent and the fact that the D&C was not consistent with best practice. With that, a lot of women don't realise that that's the case until they come into our group and then they read and research and find out that actually they were at that critical time period where they should not have had a D&C. And then there's also the added complexity with Asherman syndrome where escalating a complaint requires energy, and a lot of the time women get to the point they've spent all that time trying to get a diagnosis, and then they've spent so much time and money and energy on treatment that when that is either successful or unsuccessful, by that point they're emotionally taxed and they just cannot go through the process of making the complaint and rehashing everything.
The other interesting thing is that some women are starting to be told by other doctors that maybe they should have been warned about this risk. So, for example, I know in the aftermath of my D&C, I actually had a doctor at the same hospital tell me that they wouldn't have done a D&C on me if I'd been their patient because my presenting condition just potentially hadn't warranted that. And that was news to me. So I later asked if they would put that in writing, thinking they never would. That they would have just said it to me and not be prepared to put their name to it. And then 2 weeks later in the post, I got a 2-page report from them, no charge on their letterhead, saying absolutely everything that they'd said to me. So I think there are definitely doctors wanting to stand up with women and get this addressed, which is really promising. We can feel that support behind us, and we really appreciate it.
Can you tell me what women are complaining about and what outcomes they might be hoping for?
When women make complaints, it's dependent on the individual as to what they're hoping for from that complaint. Some might be hoping to get some recognition of the adverse outcomes that they've experienced. Some might be hoping for changes to policies and procedures so that other women don't have the same experiences as them. Some might be aiming for awareness raising about the outcomes of their D&C so that doctors can take this into account when offering the procedure to other women, because often doctors aren't getting that feedback that they've caused this condition for women. And some women might be seeking support with the financial costs incurred as a result of their Ashermans. In terms of the responses seen, we've seen the full range, right from the head of one obstetrics department meeting with a woman and agreeing to alter the consent protocols for D&C procedures at their hospitals, which is quite fantastic, through to doctors and hospitals refusing to meet with women at all. Women sometimes are getting a blaming response along the lines of, well, you signed the consent form, you knew the risks. I personally received this response and it's not true, I didn't know the risks. My obstetrician and hospital declined to meet with me when I requested to, after finding out that I had a diagnosis of Asherman's and was accruing pretty significant treatment costs. I found it really shocking that they refused to meet with me. These are the people and the professionals that you've trusted at your most vulnerable time, and it was a real shock that they didn't want to talk to me at all when things had gone wrong. They were very happy to take my money when things were going well. Another very common response is for women to be told that their outcome of getting Asherman's is just really rare and unlucky. It's just a fluke bad thing that happens to a few people. And it's only really now that women are starting to have greater access to not information about the risks, that some of them are realising that they're actually at quite high risk of developing Asherman's and that they just weren't told about that. Some women have tried complaining to individual complaints mechanisms, so for example ARPRA, but again we're not aware of a single situation where that's been effective. The way that they appear to have handled some complaints does seem quite concerning. For example, taking a statement from the obstetrician which says, you know, what I did was necessary, and then just completely closing the file without interviewing the woman or any of the other witnesses involved, which that gives the doctors a huge amount of power in the situation if they can just say, no, I did what I had to do, and then the file's closed without any further consideration. It's very rare, actually I'm not aware of a single situation where a woman has received any financial support to deal with the outcomes from her D&C, unless she pursues it as a medical negligence claim, which obviously requires some risk taking, and you have to be pretty confident that you're going to succeed. So it's a huge thing, and a lot of women just wouldn't be willing to risk that. But interestingly, we are seeing an uptick in women that are going this path after other complaints avenues just haven't achieved anything at all. This was covered in ABC's article by Olivia Willis last year. She spoke to a medical negligence lawyer who in the last couple of years had handled 3 Asherman's cases, which that's an increasing area of interest, we think, in the medical negligence field.
So we've heard about the difficulties women can face when they make complaints in relation to their D&C, but obviously women are starting to gain traction now. This issue has been covered by ABC multiple times in the past 12 months, and we've been able to gather an array of experts for today's presentation. Laura, why are things coming together now, and why was it so hard to be heard initially?
It's really hard for women to be heard when they're isolated. So when you're told that it's basically your fault because you signed the consent form, you're not going to feel like there's much to advocate for. And the lack of awareness, not just in the general public, but also in the medical community, has been a huge barrier.
Now let's have a look at the history of Asherman syndrome. So the D&C first came to use in the late 1800s. By 1894, German gynaecologist Dr. Fritsch had identified intrauterine adhesions in a woman who had a postpartum D&C and subsequently had menstrual period loss. There were more cases noted in the years following this, and then the condition was properly described in 1948 by Israeli gynaecologist Dr. Joseph Asherman. In 1960, there was a research paper by a Canadian gynaecologist who noted in relation to Asherman syndrome, vigorous and overzealous puerperal and postabortal curettage is the most common etiological factor, and curettage in the 3rd or 4th postpartum week is potentially the most serious one. To be honest, it's a real kick in the guts to be reading this in 2023 and knowing what's going on now.
So as is being discussed, from the 1960s onwards there was increasing literature around Asherman's, but it wasn't really accessible to women with the condition or who might be at risk of developing the condition unless they had a medical degree or read medical journals. So women who developed the condition continued to receive the message that it was rare, they're unlucky, they'd signed the consent form, too bad, so sad. So the same sort of messages that some women are still getting today. But by the 1990s, the internet was starting to come to life, which was a game changer in terms of access to information and access to support. So in 1999, a woman from Cyprus called Polly Spirou had 2 D&Cs after the loss of her twin pregnancy at 23 weeks. So the first D&C didn't successfully move all of the placental tissue, so she had another one. She went on to eventually be diagnosed with Asherman syndrome, but there was such little information about it available at the time that her specialists didn't even get the name correct. They gave her the wrong spelling, and it took her a really long time to find information about the condition online. And there was really hardly anything available on the internet at that time. But she knew how much she was struggling, and she knew that she needed to find other women with the condition. She couldn't find any support groups online, so she thought she would just start one herself. So that's how our international Asherman's community actually started. It was a woman in Cyprus called Polly who created a Yahoo group. So she was hoping that women would find the group, and they did. They came from all around the world, and they started to share their stories, and they realised the similarities in what was happening to them and the lack of knowledge that they had about the condition and how hard it had been for many of them to be diagnosed. In 2009, it became a Facebook group, which made it, again, much more accessible to women, and today it's got thousands of members from all around the world. Inspired by the connections that were being made in these groups, women started to make local groups. So in 2013, an Australian woman, Kylie, started an Australian support group. And it was through these Facebook groups that the Australian and New Zealander women who were in our current support group and who are involved in our advocacy efforts have met.
I'm keen to hear what it was like for Australian women before it was possible to connect with other women with the condition. Helen Tate Bruin, you developed Asherman's in 1994. Can you tell me a bit about your journey?
When my son was born in 1994, I had a retained placenta, which we didn't know about until he was 4 weeks old, and I had a hemorrhage. I went into the hospital and they gave me a D&C to get rid of the retained products. There was nothing to indicate that there was anything wrong until when he was 12 months old. I stopped breastfeeding and no periods came back, and I thought that things were just being slow. When he was 18 months, I went to a specialist and at the hospital where he was born, and they did a hysteroscopy and told me that I had Asherman's. Then they told me that they could treat it. So I went back to them and had the first surgery with them to try and clear the Asherman's. That was a hysteroscopy. They ended up perforating my uterus, which is always fun, and then sent me on to another specialist that they thought could help me. Then I went on to the next specialist and I had 2 surgeries with him. I can't even remember who he was. Then he couldn't help me, so I had 3 more surgeries with another specialist by the name of Huterode, and he did his best but couldn't clear it, and then he referred me on to Professor Vancaillie, and as he was friends with him, they did a surgery together, and then Professor V did 2 more surgeries. This all took from when my son was 18 months old until he was nearly 5. So that was 9 surgeries altogether to try and clear it. By the time Professor V did the 3rd one, he wasn't so sure that I would ever be clear of it, and he said surrogacy or adoption were probably my best options. Somehow, 4 months after that, I got pregnant with my daughter. It was the worst pregnancy you could ever imagine. I went into hospital at 15 weeks because she was trying to be born. I was starting to dilate. Then I went home, and then at 22 weeks, the dilation was getting worse, so I had a suture put in. A week later, that suture broke, and I ended up in hospital for the next 11 weeks until they told me that because I was 34 weeks, I could go home everything would be okay if she was born, and she was born the next day. Very early in the morning, massive hemorrhage, ended up losing 3 litres of blood. She and I were both revived on the operating table. She was only 34 weeks, so she went to the intensive care, and I was in hospital for 2 weeks trying to recover. And because of the Ashermans, I had also had a placenta increta, where the placenta grows into the wall of the uterus, and a complete placenta previa. And so during her birth, to stop the bleeding, I had a hysterectomy. So that put an end to any more babies.
And even though your surgeries and the birth of your daughter were behind you by the time the Australian Asherman's group started up in 2013, you chose to join the group that year. Why?
I joined because I wanted people to be able to see someone who'd had a success story at the end of Asherman's. Although I've had complications for the rest of my life. After that, I've had issues with my ovaries and adhesions all through my abdomen. I wanted people to see that Asherman's wasn't the end of the line, and there are other people around that have it and have got through it, because when I was going through it, there was nobody around to talk to who had ever had it.
So this is a condition that can have lifelong impacts on a woman.
Absolutely. The biggest thing for me was during my subsequent pregnancy, all the complications caused me to end up having to have a hysterectomy at the end of it. And apparently it's quite common to have accretas or incretas after Asherman's and lose your uterus. And so not being able to have any more children was a big impact for me. There's also, I've still got adhesions inside all around that some of them were caused by having to have the hysterectomy and some by the Asherman's itself. My ovaries have both had to be removed because of all the adhesions. So I went through menopause at 31. And there's just ongoing stuff for your whole life, really. There's it's just hard knowing that one little DNC is what caused all these problems.
So we heard before that advocacy isn't really possible when women are feeling isolated or feel that they caused their situation so have nothing to advocate for. But now women are able to connect with each other, support each other and learn from each other. This has led to a coordinated advocacy campaign. Laura, how have women found their voices on this issue?
The first part of us finding our voices was learning to challenge the common misconceptions associated with our condition. This helped women to realise that it wasn't actually their fault. I'm going to share with you 4 women speaking out against some of the dismissive things people have said to us in the past when we've raised concerns about this condition.
Informed consent is not signing a form. Informed consent is a discussion about the risks, benefits, and alternatives to what's on offer. The onus is on you as the doctor to use your expertise in discussing all of those things with the patient, with giving them time to understand and make a decision. I've had a DNC 3 times with 3 separate doctors, and on only one of those occasions did the doctor actually go through that process. Another thing to consider is that Asherman syndrome risk increases with how many DNCs you've had, so make sure you factor that in.
As I explained earlier, the the Ashermans caused years of surgeries. I've had actually 21 surgeries with, I think, about 17 of them are all related to the Ashermans. I had a pregnancy from hell. I spent 3 months in the hospital away from my 5-year-old, and it's impacted my whole life. I think, yes, I have another baby, but I went through an awful lot to get her, and it's the biggest impact on my whole life. It's impacted everything.
So I'll be responding to the quote, "D&Cs are a really safe procedure and you've just been unlucky to have a bad outcome." So in my case, having 2 D&Cs in such a short period of time, despite me expressing to my specialist that I was concerned about the consequences of that, because of those D&Cs being performed actually within 3 months of one another, it took up my risk to 40%, and I wasn't actually informed of that. I told my specialist at the time, I'm actually a neuropsychologist by background, that, based on my reading and the stories of other women, I was concerned about incurring scarring, and I was actually told that it's quite an abstract, minimal risk, and I needed to psychologically move on from my miscarriage. Well, as a result of that second D&C, it set me on a path of infertility. I've had to undergo over 7 procedures and spend tens and thousands of dollars, over 100,000 to be precise, in order to try and have a child and conceive. And unfortunately, the extent of the scarring is so severe that I will not be able to carry a child. So it's more than just a bad outcome. It has had a significant impact on my life and led to a lot of grief and trauma as a result of that. And the difficult part that I'm having a hard time with reconciling is that it was preventable. If that initial D&C had been performed under ultrasound guidance, then there wouldn't have been retained products and there wouldn't have been a need for repeated D&Cs. Also, in terms of the escalating pathway of management that occurred, there are other procedures that I could have gone for rather than having a D&C within that period. And I felt like I really wasn't provided with informed consent. I was treated like a number, despite really seeking that specialised support. So yeah, in my opinion, really the purpose of my story and my experience and others is to have a look at how can we prevent this from happening, because miscarriages, they are common, but if they are treated in a patient-centred way through the provision of informed consent, through ultrasound guidance, through having a look at other alternative options prior to resorting to a D&C within a short period of time, infertility can be prevented.
Before being diagnosed with Asherman syndrome, I hadn't heard of it, and a lot of the women that I've spoken to admit that had the condition hadn't either. I don't think this is to do with the amount of women affected by Asherman syndrome, but that lack of awareness just goes to show how lonely it can make that journey be. You feel like you need to advocate for yourself and find those answers on your own, right from diagnosis to treatment. It's a massive issue.
Bonnie Corbin from the Australian Women's Health Alliance. Are these the sort of responses women commonly come up against when they try to speak out about issues with their healthcare?
Not only so that they've been given, that they have given informed consent, but also so that they're equipped with that knowledge afterwards in case they do need to seek treatment later.
Bonnie Corbin from the Australian Women's Health Alliance. Are these the sort of responses women commonly come up against when they try to speak out about issues with their healthcare?
Generations of women have lived through women's healthcare being demeaning, discriminatory, judgmental, and of poor quality. We've been stereotyped as dirty, shameful, or guilty when seeking help for these very personal health issues. The health sector is decades behind other sectors in terms of community engagement. There are often lots of feedback mechanisms where we can provide feedback to health providers, but the communication loop is often left unopened. How do they learn from our difficult situations and use that knowledge to develop their informed consent policies, develop new clinical training, edit clinical guidelines, or design new health products? It seems like we don't hear back enough about if or how learnings from our traumatic health system experiences will be used to prevent the same thing from happening again to others.
I think it's absolutely wonderful that it's being brought up so much and being brought to the forefront, because I've tried to warn people when they've said they're going to have a D&C in the past, but knowing that there's something official out there that people can read and look at and hear about is going to be really good to help stop this complication.
For me, I'd like to keep going forward being involved with raising awareness and the importance of informed consent.
For context, these advocacy efforts are taking place at a time when there is increasing recognition that women's health has been neglected for years and that gender inequality exists in healthcare. Bonnie Corbin, Chair of the Australian Women's Health Alliance, can you give us some more background on this?
Women are the majority of health consumers, the majority of service providers, and the majority of carers. Women are overrepresented in caring jobs and professions and underrepresented in health leadership. We are on the cusp of power shifts within health leadership models, and consumer groups like this are gaining greater platforms to speak out. Younger generations have had enough. Thanks to our digital cultures and global pressures like climate change, young people are speaking out about these universal and gendered health issues like never before. This is reflected in recent discussions about medical misogyny. We've heard hundreds, if not thousands, of women in Australia sharing stories about gendered discrimination within health services and systems. The National Women's Health Strategy and National Women's Health Council are two of many mechanisms that the government has engaged to drive change. We've had more health policy reforms in the areas of women's health in the past 5 years than in the past 50, but we're only at the start of that reform process, and it takes resources and community-wide effort to turn this policy into action. Attitudes within health and hospital services are reflective of the communities that they're located within. If we want to encourage anti-discrimination in our health services, including using informed and enthusiastic consent processes, we require community-wide change, respect and compassion for genuine humanity and gender equality. The work of Asherman's Australia is an example of a community-led movement towards intergenerational change. Thank you to all of you for sharing your energy and wisdom and your collective change-making. Our hard work of today will ensure that future generations won't experience the same barriers or discrimination within health systems, and they can have genuine access to care and healing.
So we've got increasing confidence in women, but mounting a successful public advocacy campaign has been a really huge learning curve. We realised that a first important step in sharing our voices and letting people know about us was creating a website with information about the journeys of women with the condition in Australia and New Zealand. So we felt this would be helpful not only for women with the condition, but also for family and friends who are trying to support them. This sort of content is really different from reading medical textbook kind of material, which is generally all that people were having access to. So how do you make a website? Well, you ask everyone in the group and find out who can help. And as it turned out, the brother of one of the women in the group worked in web design. He put together a website free of charge, and then the aunt of one of the women in the group offered up some artwork to use on the website. And we really treasure all of this input. It just shows how wide-reaching the impacts of Asherman's are, not just on the woman and her immediate family, but also the extended family of those women as well.
So here's a picture of Tim Trainer, who created our website with his sister Rebecca. She had Asherman syndrome and flew to Sydney for treatment by Professor Vancaillie, and she was able to have 2 pregnancies after that. There's also a screenshot there of our website, which we really encourage you to go and check out. And here's a picture of Lucinda Sherlock, who created the beautiful artwork on the website and one of her paintings.
So Laura, can you explain why did the group decide to target RANZCOG with these advocacy efforts?
Our previous approach of contacting hospitals and doctors individually just wasn't working, and it was very time consuming. We knew that it also wasn't going to create systemic change. And then we were told if RANZCOG didn't update their guidelines in relation to D&Cs, then it was unlikely that doctors were going to change the way that they practiced. We also know that RANZCOG play a really crucial role in developing and promoting best practice, and unfortunately they were just really missing the mark here.
This is an email sent to RANZCOG back in 2018. I specifically asked them about the lack of informed consent given by women when they have this procedure, and I also asked their stance on conservative treatment options. As you'll see from their response, they avoided answering either of those questions, and they referred me back to Professor Vancaillie if I had any more questions about Asherman syndrome. So they did not take any leadership on preventing the condition, and nor are they leading best practice to reduce the incidence of Asherman syndrome.
So prior to 2021, multiple women had tried contacting RANZCOG individually to make complaints about D&Cs, so including concerns about lack of consent for the procedure, and also that the practice that they were seeing carried out was not aligned with current research evidence on how to do things in the best possible way. We didn't really see much of a response from RANZCOG in relation to these complaints. They would generally either direct people to Professor Vancaillie or say in response to individual situations that they just couldn't get involved. In June 2021, an American woman sent a petition to ACOG, which is the American equivalent of RANZCOG, and the woman called Sarah, she was petitioning for them to review their guidelines around D&Cs and management of retained products of conception. So Australian women asked if it was possible to adapt a copy of the letter for the Australian context, and Sarah agreed, so we did that. We had women from all around Australia working on this adapted letter, which we sent to RANZCOG in September 2021. In November 2021, women from Asherman's Australia and New Zealand had our first meeting with RANZCOG, and there was no outcomes from this meeting. We met with the president, Dr. Bopp, and I don't think we really kept him on the line for more than 15 minutes. It was very quick, and yeah, we just had to hope that we would build a relationship and achieve more in future.
In November 2022, ABC published a radio piece on Asherman syndrome, and in that, Dr. Bopp stated that RANZCOG were keen to engage, however there had been no action from him in the 12 months prior. In April 2023, the ABC published the feature article on their website, and in that article, Dr. Bopp stated that he wasn't aware of any specific efforts being undertaken by the college around Asherman syndrome, This didn't come as a surprise to us, as in the second meeting with Dr. Bob, the first thing he said when he connected in the meeting was that he had to go soon, he had a clinic to run, and he would leave this with the incoming president. The incoming president was Dr. Gillian Gibson, and we met with her in July 2023. After this meeting, things seemed very promising. She was very warm and compassionate. However, we were a little disheartened when the focus was mainly on early miscarriage and D&Cs in relation to that. In November 2023, the ABC published the TV, news, radio and online pieces about Asherman syndrome and the advocacy efforts with RANZCOG. It takes a lot of courage to cover a story like this, so we do want to thank the journalists and their editors who did venture into unfamiliar territory to do so. We are really proactive with media coverage, and the minute one story has aired, we're asking questions about where to from here.
So I'm just going to try and tie together what we've been talking about with women trying to advocate at an individual level, so raising their concerns with individual doctors, hospitals, health consumers, bodies, AHPRA. It doesn't seem like it's been effective at all at addressing this issue systemically, because it doesn't seem like anyone's collecting the data and using it in a meaningful way to go, oh, okay, there's a problem, we're seeing this issue around the country and a lot of the complaints in relation to this procedure are the same. That doesn't seem to be happening. So it does need a systemic advocacy lens, and RANZCOG is our best option with that, but it's been quite hard and slow with them as well, and that's potentially because they're in a difficult spot. I mean, they're there to promote best practice in women's healthcare, but they're also there to promote and advocate for the needs of their members, so doctors who pay the fees and are RANZCOG members, and there'd be a full range across those members about how people might feel on review of guidelines. So there'd be the ones that might feel overwhelmed or reluctant to have things change when they've done things a certain way their whole career, and then there'd be ones on the other end of the spectrum who desperately want changes and want reviewed guidelines because they know that they're needed and they're sick of seeing negative outcomes for women. So it's going to be hard for RANZCOG to please everyone, and it could act as a barrier to them making quick progress on the issue. If you had someone external that people could go to about a systemic healthcare issue that they're seeing, around the country, that might be a way around that conflict that RANZCOG might sometimes feel, or other medical colleges might feel in that situation. So it would be great if the federal government could consider how this might be addressed, particularly in relation to women's healthcare, where it can be so hard to make progress. And we're seeing these situations where you've got a group of women from all around the country saying the exact same thing about their experiences, having the same concerns. There needs to be someone that we can go to be heard and to have some recommendations made so that changes can occur.
Mr. Adrian Lower. The women raised concerns about the difficulties RANZCOG may have in navigating the line between promoting clinical practice that is consistent with peer practice as opposed to consistent with evidence-based best practice. Do you have any thoughts on this?
The main issue here is that the college is mandated to provide best practice and is leading the way with informed consent. However, many senior obstetricians and gynaecologists just don't accept the frequency of Asherman syndrome following these procedures. Now, in the UK, we have NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. The NICE produces guidelines formulated by committees based on the available evidence and thorough literature review of similar cases and up-to-date research. And often the Royal Colleges will have input into the development of these guidelines along with service users and service providers. And the idea is to try and get a guideline, and once there's a guideline in place, if you manage a case in a way that deviates from the guidelines, then you could be held to be not acting in the patient's best interests.
You might be wondering why patient voice matters when it comes to making clinical guidelines. After all, doctors are the experts. At the moment, there is no obligation for patient voice to be considered when developing clinical guidelines. For example, even though RANZCOG have said they are now reviewing the guidelines for early miscarriage, they have not engaged with our group whatsoever as part of this process. They have only engaged with our specialist, Professor Vancaillie, despite our years of advocacy efforts towards their organisation. The health consumer perspective is crucial, as we are the ones living with the impacts of the condition every day. Laura, I understand you're aware of a recent example out of the UK that shows the positive outcomes that can be achieved when women's voices are incorporated when creating guidelines for women's health issues. Can you talk about that further?
Yeah, it's very exciting to hear about this one. In the UK, women with chronic UTI recently had success in their advocacy efforts with NICE. A clinical guideline on management of the condition was released, and it has since been adopted by the British National Health Service. Australian women have spoken out in the media about their hope for Australia to adopt this NICE guideline here, because we have nothing that's on par. It demonstrates the great work that NICE is doing, but we know Australia needs its own body instead of just adopting British guidelines, given the unique challenges experienced in Australian healthcare, for example, distance. It really is important for the federal government to invest in a body like NICE. Naomi and I met with Federal Health Minister Jed Kearney's office in January 2024. We outlined our concerns about RANZCOG's lack of progress on providing updated guidance on the D&C procedure, given our years of advocacy. We'd hoped that the federal government might be concerned about this, given that they fund RANZCOG. In this meeting, unfortunately, we were informed that the federal government will not become involved in this situation, and that we just need to accept that change takes years and continue working on our relationship with RANZCOG.
Yeah, we were told to treat the new RANZCOG president as a fresh opportunity, and we said, well, we're actually on to our third RANZCOG president. How many fresh opportunities do we need to have? We were also told to put more effort into building up strong relationships within the women's health sector to draw awareness to our cause. And it was said to us as though we were actually paid professionals in the sector. We explained that we're really tired. We've been trying to do this for years. It's all voluntary work, which is re-traumatising for us. There needs to be a system in place where concerns like this can be reported, and professionals in the sector with appropriate connections and expertise can get it addressed. It's not reasonable to put it on us. We don't have financial resources for this, let alone the time. We've never intended to join the women's health sector as an organisation, and nor should we have to. We're just a group of women who don't want other women to suffer unnecessarily from a health procedure when we know and the evidence tells us that there's often a better way. We did ask Jed Kearney's office whether the federal government will commit to establishing an independent body for addressing systemic health concerns. This question was completely avoided during our meeting, despite our repeated attempts to raise it. We kept being redirected. We also asked for a written response from Jed Kearney, and there was none. Instead, in the letter, we were heartily commended on our efforts to raise awareness about Asherman syndrome, and we were also directed to contact a government-funded project around pregnancy guidelines, the tender for which was actually awarded to RANZCOG last year. They didn't mention that in the letter though. We looked that up and found that out. And it seems totally unreasonable. We've spent several years advocating to RANZCOG, and you actually expect us to go and chase them down in multiple forums to share the same message. Disappointingly, the letter from Ged Kearney also completely failed to even acknowledge our concerns about RANZCOG and them not responding to our concerns about the D&C procedure and the lack of evidence-based care that women are receiving. The good thing that did come out of our meeting with Ged Kearney's office was that we were set up to meet with public servants from the Federal Health Department. We met with them just a week prior to International Women's Day, and to our great surprise, they were actually fantastic. We've got a really low bar for meetings with anyone due to our lack of success over the years, so it was a welcome change to have 3 women who were all ears for what we had to say. Unfortunately, they did not appear to have been briefed about us much at all, beyond perhaps thinking that we wanted to raise awareness of Asherman syndrome. This became evident quite quickly in the meeting when one of them asked us if we have tried talking to RANZCOG about our concerns about D&Cs, because RANZCOG might be able to write a clinical guideline on this. Laura and I had to laugh at this, as this is what we've been trying to do for years. These women listened to us as we explained the efforts that we've made. They agreed that we've tried all of the reasonable things that they could have suggested for much longer than is reasonable, and that this is not even our work to do. It's not our responsibility. And they also, on the spot, started to brainstorm some practical ways that they might try to get it addressed by talking to people, including RANZCOG, so that they were offering to put themselves out there in ways to try and help us, which was amazing. And that's all we've wanted all along. We've wanted people to just be proactive and have conversations and actually listen to us. It was such a contrast to the meeting we had with Ged Kearney's office, where we were told to work harder and that it was up to us. We're sharing this anecdote because if you're an individual or organisation that's meeting with aggrieved health consumers, you really have no idea what they've gone through ahead of their meeting with you. And if you can be compassionate, it will go a long way. Although it's great to know that there are some amazing and compassionate people in the health department, good leadership starts at the top. It starts at the minister's office or the assistant minister's office, as they're the ones setting the tone and the priorities. We have not been given the opportunity to meet directly with Ged Kearney herself, despite asking to do so, but we would welcome this now, especially as a redo of our original meeting with her office. You might have heard that the federal government has recently opened endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics around the country. It's great to see more resources going into women's healthcare. Unfortunately, however, these centres don't actually have capacity to either diagnose or treat Asherman syndrome. So we would welcome any moves to expand the treatment available at these clinics so that they can help more women with Asherman syndrome and other women's health conditions. But in relation to Asherman syndrome, we recognise that prevention is far better than cure, and for a lot of women this condition may be preventable. So there needs to be updated clinical guidelines on D&Cs, which is what we've been advocating for all along.
And you might be wondering what the state and territory government's role is in handling systemic health concerns. State and territory governments fund individual health consumer complaints mechanisms. If you look up reviews for these organisations, it seems that there are many people concerned about the lack of teeth in these organisations. They are not set up to deal with systemic issues. This again highlights the need for an independent national body concerned with addressing systemic health concerns. Laura, Naomi, it would be great to hear a brief summary from you. What action needs to be taken from here?
So the key takeaways are, as we've been saying throughout, we need clinical guidelines on D&Cs that are taking into account the current research evidence and women's experiences, and this will mean that doctors and women alike are aware of the risks and the alternative treatment options. We need to increase GP awareness about this condition and what referrals they might need to make when a woman might be at risk of having it. We need to increase access to diagnosis and treatment. And we also need to have the federal government commit to setting up an independent body for handling systemic health complaints.
And now I want to hear from everyone else. what actions do you think we need to take from here to reduce the likelihood of women experiencing negative impacts from D&C procedures?
Going forward, we need greater awareness among patients or women, greater awareness among general practitioners, and also greater awareness amongst colleague gynecologists. Next, we will then also need greater prevention, and that will, as I said before, include performing surgical intervention if needed under guidance of ultrasound, and preventing or reducing the risk for infection by using prophylactic antibiotics.
So the way forward, I think, is really about education. The more people who are involved in women's healthcare and more broadly who are aware of Asherman syndrome as a diagnosis and a condition, the more we're going to be able to do our best to diagnose it, to treat it, and to prevent it.
There are some links here for where you can go to get more information. To get in contact with the women from Asherman's Australia, you can email ashermans.australia@gmail.com. Please be aware that this is all volunteer work, so the women can take a while to respond. If you're after support because you're dealing with Asherman's, you're best off going to the website www.ashermansaustralia.com and following the links to Facebook support groups. Thanks everyone for listening in to this webinar and making it through to the end. We hope you can spread the word about this condition in your professional and personal networks. Please stay tuned. We'll be holding a live webinar later in the year for an interactive discussion about the way forward with the D&C procedure in Australia. Details about this will be advertised through the Women's Health and Research Institute Australia and through Asherman's Australia and New Zealand public Facebook page.